Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fiscal Fridays. Before we get started, please consider liking this video and subscribing to IFF content to get the latest updates in your newsfeed. There has been lots of discussion about Congress raising the debt ceiling yet again. Now, many have cited that this was not expected to happen so soon, but rampant spending from the COVID pandemic, government welfare programs, and so-called Inflation Reduction Act accelerated the United States debt problem. Idaho's leadership is complicit in this spending disaster, with Governor Little's budget recommendation sourcing 42% of all state funds from the feds. This equates to about $5.8 billion. But wait, there's more. You better believe that all of this money comes with hefty strings attached to help enact Biden's leftist agenda right here in the Gem State. To help us break this down, we brought in IFF's resident budget expert, Fred Birnbaum, to weigh in. Fred is widely accepted by both friends and critics as the man who knows the state budget better than anyone else. Fred currently serves as the Legislative Affairs Director at IFF and brings with him a lifetime of budget and policy experience from both the public and private sectors. Here was our conversation.
Hey, Fred, thank you for joining us today.
Niklas, thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you. So you have a series of articles coming out about the budget and what the legislators did all session and what this looks like for the 2024 fiscal year. And in your latest article, you cited a surprising statistic that the budget has grown more than 50% in the last 4 years. Now, critics would say that this is due to the heavy injection of federal funding from COVID. Is that really the whole story behind those big numbers that we're talking about?
The short answer is no. I mean, certainly that's contributed to it, and it's contributed in several ways. One, there's been a direct injection of federal dollars to state government. So the federal government has transferred money for spending. And so that has obviously resulted in more spending. But the federal government has also transferred a lot of money to the citizens of Idaho and local. To put that in perspective, before COVID, the state appropriated all funds, about $9 billion. COVID money through various packages like ARPA and others added another $22.9 billion. So, several times the amount that the state was spending before. And that money, in addition to driving state spending directly, is also swelled tax revenues, which is then, of course, given the state more revenues to spend in the general fund. So yes, there's direct federal money, but there's also inflationary induced spending, and that has swelled revenues. And a good example, food is up 10 to 15%, and the sales tax is 6% of food, and food is higher. The state gets more money from sales taxes. So that's enabled more spending. So it's very problematic, and we'll get into it more, but the federal largesse, and of course it's not just Idaho, has enabled a massive growth in the government, and it's also allowed the governor to make these claims about how fiscally conservative he is because he's balanced the budget, when it's not so. Sure, he's balanced the budget, but it was very easy to do when you're flooded with federal dollars.
So, absolutely. So to cover all of that additional federal spending, the Federal Reserve has been printing and borrowing more and more money to cover the costs. As we see, that's the primary discussion in DC is trying to figure out how they're going to raise the debt ceiling so they can cover more spending in this ever-growing federal budget. And so, as the rise of inflation starts to affect the prices of groceries and gas and the cost of living here in Idaho, we haven't seen this in decades. And so is the inflation the reason why this new spending looks so large, or is it are we growing faster than inflation?
We're growing government faster than inflation, certainly. And I can actually cite a very interesting number for you. People who are listening might not be familiar with the budgeting process, but every year, Idaho's Joint Legislative Finance Committee, the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, they start with what they call a base budget. And that's the prior year budget where they remove one-time items and they set up this base. And then they add maintenance items, which could be pay raises, inflationary adjustments, and then they add new spending. But the base is always considered the ongoing spending. What do we spend year after year? And to the extent that the base is growing, that means underlying government is growing. The base from 23 to 24, and we don't have final 24 numbers yet at the detail level, was up 17% from roughly 9.7 to 11.3 billion. So that's, again, the base before we add maintenance adjustments and new spending. And for the last 5 years, the average annual growth rate has been over 8%. So government is growing. It's not just one-time spending. The federal money has been used as sort of a cloaking device, if you will. Oh, it's just one-time spending, and we're doing roads and bridges, which is true. But really, every agency of government is growing, and they're growing their base spending amount.
Wow, and actually we saw a lot of that while we were doing our spending index analyses as well. We saw a lot of evidence in that as these budgets were rolling through and we were having to vote on those. And so what the IFF found is that about 2 out of every 5 agency budgets reviewed this year demonstrated a maintenance budget. So that's beyond that base, but the adjusted numbers to cover the cost to maintain current operations of that agency were growing faster than the rate of inflation over the last 3 years. And we do that over the last 3 years because we're trying to eliminate any oddball spending that may come from replacement items or anything like that could create one-off year where they had a sharp rise in spending. So we're trying to average that out. A lot of these agency budgets were far above what the rate of inflation was, and some of them were many, many times greater than the rate of inflation as well. Amid all the spending, Governor Little touts that this is a balanced budget. Is this really what a balanced budget looks like? In previous episodes, I asked that same question to Ron Nate, and he said absolutely not. So what's your take on it?
So the budget is only balanced because the state is using federal dollars to balance it, and those federal dollars are borrowed. So essentially, we balanced our budget on the back of borrowed federal dollars. And I'll prove this point by going back to the early 2000s when the federal budget was last in balance. Now, some might argue it wasn't because it was using excess Social Security revenues to balance it under President Clinton. But we won't debate that point today. But when the federal budget was balanced, roughly low 30% of Idaho's total appropriation was federal dollars. And now it's in the 42-44% range the last few years. So what that means is Idaho is now able to spend more money and balance the budget because the federal government has increased its slice of the pie from roughly 30 to 40%. I mean, that's a third roughly, and that's huge. And just to put that into perspective, that's about another 1.4 billion. So if the federal government said, you know what, states, we're going to balance our budget, we have to cut our outlays to the states for programs like Medicaid, education, you'll have to come up with the difference. That would put Idaho in an imbalance. Idaho's Medicaid budget, we've written about it extensively. It's in the $4.5 billion range, and about 70% of the total budget is picked up by the feds. Imagine if the state had to pick up more of that. It's not just millions or tens of millions. It's potentially hundreds of millions and actually over $1 billion. So we are only balanced because we've grown our dependence and reliance on federal dollars. And of course, the federal government is running monumental deficits. So that's the not so short answer is we're not really in balance.
Absolutely. And with all of this additional federal spending, a lot of it's coming in from the COVID pandemic relief funding and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and that ironically named Inflation Reduction Act. And so the argument that leaders like Governor Brad Little and others in the legislature have made is that if we don't take that funding, the tax dollars that Idahoans are paying to Washington, D.C., will never come back to benefit the state of Idaho. Instead, they'll be redirected to places like California. How true are those claims?
Well, there's a grain of truth, but that's an incomplete story. So programs like Medicaid are based on a formula. And so to the extent a state decided to expand Medicaid, more money was automatically provided to cover the expansion costs. But if Idaho had chosen not to expand, the money would not have gone to any other state or states. With the COVID dollars, I believe that was how it was drafted. So if the state turned the money down, it would be redirected. There's a real moral hazard with that because now Congress, the Democrats in Congress, and even Republicans know we can force states to spend money by threatening them. If they don't take it, it'll go to California or some liberal state. But really, if you think about that, that's sort of a gun to your head analogy. The other problem with it is people say we're getting our tax dollars back. Our tax dollars, as you mentioned earlier, did not cover these packages like the American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. I think we can say that with confidence because prior to those, we were running a deficit. They're incremental spending. So if you're already running a deficit and you spend more, you're not actually spending tax dollars, you're borrowing to cover those costs. So this was incrementally borrowed dollars, and states were told, well, if you don't take it, we'll send it somewhere else. But there was not a single Republican in Congress who voted for ARPA. Yet once it came here, everyone is, oh, we got to spend it. And that's really morally very dangerous. It was recognized as bad. Every Republican in Congress, and that's a lot of votes, talking about the House, the U.S. House and Senate, votes no, and then the money comes here and we welcome it with open arms. And so I think it's very problematic, the posture that Idaho and other supposedly conservative states have taken, which, well, we got to spend this money. And that's the backstory behind it.
Absolutely. And what makes that money especially terrible to accept is that there are a lot of strings attached to that money. One of the final things I want to make sure we cover in this episode is how federal money does influence policy, and really spending and budgeting itself is policy. And so, but you see in JFAC, there's often these arguments about what's a budget and what's policy and what the distinction is. And sometimes those lines seem really blurred, for lack of a better word to use. And so is there really a distinction between spending and policy in the Idaho budgeting process?
So there are policy bills that are written that require spending to fund them. So, for example, the Empowering Parents, there's a bill that passes, and then the funding is provided by JFAC. And there are many examples. And that's certainly an example where the policy is passed and then the funding follows. But there are many other examples where the spending bill is the policy bill. And actually a very good example, when JFAC appropriated more money for Medicaid because the federal government said, look, during the quote unquote public health emergency tied to COVID, if you don't kick anyone off, whether they're eligible or not, in fact, even if they are ineligible, as long as they don't die or leave the state or want to be disenrolled, if you don't kick people off, we're going to give you a 6% enrichment, of the federal state match. And in layman's terms, well over $100 million more. So keep people on who are not eligible, and we'll give you more money. That's a policy decision. And the reason it is such a big policy decision is now that that's expired, we have to then remove them because that's the law requires it. And of course, that match will end. And that's also the string that's attached. And Medicaid is a very good example that JFAC, the Finance and Appropriations Committee, is making all sorts of policy decisions just through how it writes the budget bill.
And really, though, this federal funding, as we were going through the spending index and we were seeing how these budgets were affected, we found that just over 40% of all the bills that we analyzed received negative points for being for demonstrating too much federal control or just an egregious amount of federal control or expanding that federal control in that budget and in Idaho. And so what, and I think that you covered this well, and thank you, Fred, for going through these issues and really picking it apart for us and helping us understand not only why it's bad to accept so much federal spending, but also how that's affected our fiscal practices in Idaho and how that budget's really grown. So thank you very much.
Niklas, thanks for having me, and you're welcome.
Thank you for taking the time to watch that great discussion with Fred. Once again, don't forget to like and subscribe IFF content to stay in the know in Idaho politics. To see more of Fred's work, including his spending and budget articles, or catch past episodes of Fiscal Fridays, legislative analyses, podcasts, and more, please visit idahofreedom.org.